working. So Dave wanted me just to do a very short rundown on some etiquette. So what I will do shortly is I will mute everyone so that we don't get any extraneous noises in the background. Cars revving, dogs barking, wives indicating they're unhappy that you're doing this instead of doing something they'd rather you were doing, that kind of stuff. So if you do wish to speak, Dave's preferred indicator is to raise your hand. And when you wish to speak, if you hold the space bar down, it's like a press to talk. So you don't have to keep clicking on the mute on and off. The only other thing I'll add, you'll notice that we occasionally get popped into share screen mode. If you do that accidentally, I will just unshare you. I mentioned a little bit earlier, so for those of you who have just got one big screen, currently presumably with me talking and a row of faces across the top, if you want to see more people, what you do is in the top right-hand corner, make sure I've got the correct right, there's a button that says Gallery View, and that just changes to a big grid. Looks like a big Brady Bunch set where you can see everyone. So I think that's about it from me. I'll give it back to Dave.
Cool. Well, we're quite privileged to have our first speaker, Mike Nicholls, who's going to talk a little bit on what's happening currently with the John Smith collection. And John Smith was a legend in New Zealand aviation, and he collected all sorts of warbirds from Ruakahia rubbish dump and from Woodburn disposals of Air Force, ex-wartime Air Force aircraft, and put it all in a shed. And he had it there for years and years and years, just preserved. And unfortunately, John passed away last year after an illness, and the family are now working on a plan to do something with some of the aircraft. So over to you, Mike, if Phil can unmute you, and we'll have a bit of an update. You'll need to unmute, Mike. Yeah, that's it.
There we go. Right. Oh, well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you all about this very important subject, or it is to me anyway, the John Smith collection. It's been, a significant collection in New Zealand over the years, and it was something that was very dear to the heart of John for many, many years. I first met John back in 1978 and visited him many times over the years. We talked about a lot of aircraft related subjects, and I always found him to be very friendly and easy to deal with, very knowledgeable, great guy to talk to. He just had to be very patient. There was, rumours around and people talked about John being difficult to deal with, but I never found him like that at all. He was a very private person, of course, and he did sometimes get annoyed by people that just fronted up and expected him to drop everything and launch into a big tour of his collection, which is understandable, I suppose. But anyway, it's a shame that he passed away, but his legacy is the collection, and that collection is now owned by the Smith family, most notably his brother George. George is 88 years old, a very sprightly 88-year-old, I would say. Last time we were on the property, George was up on the roof of the hangar trying to fix some leaks and things. Very hard to keep control of them. The other person we deal with is George's son, Robbie, and his daughter, Jo. Again, very nice people, great to deal with. And, they're doing their best to ensure that the collection is handled in the best way possible. My involvement came about late last year with myself and John Saunders. We're engaged by the family to sort and catalogue the collection, just give them a bit of advice on technical aspects and preservation, and help to sort everything out so they could work out what is there, because they're really not aviation people, so it can be quite difficult. The collection itself, consists of a bunch of aeroplanes that most people know about, and I'll go through those and I'll tell you what I can about them. But I just have to say that I don't represent the Smith family, so some things I don't know and I won't speculate on. The other thing is the collection is made up of a huge amount of spare parts. I'd say so far we've catalogued in the region of 5,000 to 10,000 piece parts from all manner of aeroplanes. Some of the sorts of things we've come across are things like walrus floats, Canberra parts, Strikemaster parts, Skyhawk parts, Huey parts, Mosquito parts, Oxford parts, a lot of Hudson stuff, Harvard stuff. So all manner of things. It's very muddled, I would say. Well, not muddled, but just stored in the shed in no specific order. A lot of it was stored in car crates. There are about 20 odd huge car crates that we've been sorting our way through. Just to give you an example of one of the crates we opened up, one of the boxes had a Mosquito fin and rudder, a Merlin crankshaft, a whole pile of Mosquito exhausts, P51 undercarriage legs, Oxford oil coolers, and a bunch of P51 ducting. And all of that was in one box, so it's a matter of trying to get all that stuff out, work out what it is, identify it and catalogue it so the family knows what they've got. The desire of the Smith family is for everything to be preserved in New Zealand if at all possible. And that's a noble cause, I think, and something they're working towards. John and myself and a bunch of other people have been over to the Smith site in Mapua. We've done about 25 trips now, and I'd estimate we've put in something like 1,500 man hours trying to sort everything. We're still not finished yet, and there's still a lot to go. I'll just work through some of the stuff and what's happened to it. So there was some Bristol Herc engines over there that John had collected, obviously from Woodburn. Those Bristol Herc engines have gone to the Bristol Society at Omaka. They've all been moved off-site apart from one which they've retained at Mapua. A lot of Oxford parts. There was a complete Oxford cockpit section which unfortunately had been left outside and deteriorated badly. But all the Oxford stuff has gone to a collector in Auckland. It's all been gathered together. So that's all been preserved. Obviously all the Hudson stuff and R1820 parts are going to Bill Reid, who's got the Hudson that he got from John Smith a few years ago. Two Harvards. There's the remains of a Mark II Harvard NZ909, which was pretty much cut up. The rear fuselage is complete. But that Harvard, along with 1068, have been sold to New Zealand Warbirds and will be moving north shortly. There's about 2.5 container loads of parts and things to go north. The Baffin fuselage, which was there, that's making its way north to Don Zabritsky, who's got the other New Zealand Baffin. It really just consists of a frame and an oil tank, but there's some parts in there that Don said he can make use of. There's a little bit of Devon stuff. And Mitford Brereton, who's got the Flying Devon, is being engaged looking at that stuff. In terms of the big aeroplanes, the P40N Gloria Lions, NZ3220 is at Omaka at the moment. And myself and John Saunders and a few other people are working on putting that aeroplane back together and doing some conservation and preservation, a bit of repair work on it and assembling that. And that'll remain with the Smith collection. Exactly where will be decided in the future. P40E NZ3043, that's been obtained by myself and John Saunders again for a rebuild to airworthy. We'll look at that project once we get through the P40N. The Tiger Moth, I think it's BQB, I think is the registration of that. That's currently stored at Omaka, and that's remaining in Smith Trust ownership. The Mosquito, which everybody seems to be interested in, that's at Mapua still. That's remaining in Smith family ownership at the moment. Exactly where it'll end up, I don't know, and I don't want to speculate on that. The Mosquito itself is in pretty good condition, considering it's a wooden aeroplane. It was outside for quite a few years, but it hasn't deteriorated badly at all. It needs some fabric work and a little bit of woodwork, but other than that, it's in great shape. It was cut for the move when John and his brother moved it from Woodburn to Mapua. The wings were cut and the fuselage was cut, but they've been joined back together really well. Unless you're an expert, you probably wouldn't even be able to find the joins. The Mustang is still at Mapua and still in Smith family ownership. The Mustang as well had the wings cut off it. They were torched outboard of the undercarriage. The outer wings are there, and along with all the other parts to get the aeroplane complete again. The main other aircraft that are there, there's the remains of 4 Vampires, including a very early F1 Vampire that came to New Zealand as an instructional airframe. The Vampire fuselages are all in quite poor condition, unfortunately, because they sat outside for a very long time before John got his hands on them and put them inside. There's a lot of Vampire parts, a couple of Goblins, and yet to be decided what will happen to all that. I'd just like to remind people that the Smith's property is not really open to visitors unless you talk to somebody in range prior, but it's not a good time to visit while things are being sorted and rearranged. I think in time, everything will be available for public viewing. It's just a matter of where and when that happens. So that's probably about where things are at the moment. I would just ask anybody, if anybody's got any photos, particularly of the P40s at either the Smith's place or at Asplin's or Rockahia, we'd really like to have a look at those. We're trying to get the P40N back into the state it was when it was in the yard immediately after RNZAF service. So photos are very helpful if you've got anything. We'd really appreciate that. So, Dave, questions?
Yeah, has anybody got any questions? If you have, put your hand up. And
John, you got anything to add? Oh, Warwick.
Warwick, unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, guys. I've got the original photo album here from the late Dave Jenkinson, who worked at Larson's.
Oh, yeah.
And I've got a few black and white photos, and then there's quite a few coloured slides. I've got all the originals. I have had them copied, and Mike Leet from Hamilton has put them on Dave's website, I think, prior to this. But I can have a hunt through there and see if there are any P40 ones. We can, see what they actually are.
Yeah, that would be really appreciated. Maybe you could just send me a PM or something, Warwick.
Yep. Thank you. Regarding your Mustang, has that still got the engines in it or not?
Yeah, the Mustang's still got the engine in it and the propellers there, all the scoop and radiator and all that is there as well, all the tail, everything's there to make it complete. It's a very nice aeroplane, that.
Okay. What about the Mosquito? The engine's still with that?
Yeah, the Mosquito's complete. It's all that's removed from it at the moment of the tail surfaces, the fin and the rudder and the horizontal, but they're all there as well.
Very good. You did mention when you were saying about aircraft parts that there was actually Skyhawk stuff there. Do you know what you've got there yet or not?
Oh, yeah, it's just small components. There's a couple of tyres and I think an undercarriage leg but small bits and pieces, stuff that's come from the scrapyard at Woodburn. Certainly nothing significant, nothing like a fuselage or wings or engine or anything like that.
Okay, no, thank you.
Cool. Is there any other questions for Mike or for John?
You got anything you want to add, John?
You need to unmute, John.
Well, there we go.
Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah. Hey, look, I just really wanted to add to what Mike was saying there. It's a pretty unique collection that John got over in Mapua there. And we're just amazed, really, that he managed to do it with so few resources. He did a lot of it with a Mori minor and a trailer, and very little help, no money, no shed. And when we look at it 50 years later, it's amazing what he collected. And I just want to emphasise the point that Mike made. You know, a lot of people have met John over the years, and everyone that had met him, I think, found him the same, and they found him a very friendly guy. He's a pretty good talker, old John. He could talk the leg off several chairs. But a very knowledgeable guy, very interesting guy. And as long as you had 3 or 4 spare hours, it was a great place to go and visit. Yeah, you know, you hear stories that he was unfriendly and he chased people off and he didn't like the Air Force and all this sort of stuff. Well, as far as I can figure out, that's all a load of rubbish. He got on well with most aircraft people. And yeah, you know, it's just amazing to see what he achieved over his lifetime.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, guys, and thank you for what you're doing to sort out that collection. And hopefully, one day we'll see some of the stuff on public view, which it's never been really. It's really good that the family wants to do something with it and sort it out. And yeah, thanks again.
Great. Yeah, my pleasure. No, I'll get back to the hangar and do some more work on the aeroplane.
Great. Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Catch you later.
Cheers, guys. And ladies.
Well, that was really cool. That's good to get an insight of what's happening there. And on the schedule, I've just got a little bit of a section here for discussion of any news or anything that's going on in aviation at the moment. And I just wanted to highlight one thing before we go any further. Because of the whole coronavirus thing, the annual service at Runnymede Cemetery is obviously not open to the public tonight, and this is the cemetery of airmen from World War II in the south of England, and they're actually doing a live broadcast, and the link for that, I'll just bring it up. The link it's on the Forces TV network, so it's www.forces.net/Runnymede. So if anybody wants to watch that, it's at 11 AM UK time, so that'll be tonight here in New Zealand. I just thought I'd mention that because I saw it come up on the internet. One other thing I want to mention, which is a really good shout out, if you haven't spotted it yet, and I think probably for me, one of the highlights of this whole lockdown period has been the Air Force Museum of New Zealand has been putting photographs up onto their new archive, which has been going for a couple of months. It started just before the lockdown, and virtually every day, Matthew O'Sullivan, the keeper of photographs there, has been putting up dozens of newly scanned, beautiful photographs from all sorts of eras in the Air Force, right from World War I right up till more modern times with the jets and that sort of thing, and lots and lots of World War II stuff. It's brilliant. Every day it's the highlight of my day to just go in there and check what's new. So I just want to highlight that and let everybody know. The link is on the forum. I can't remember, I haven't got it in front of me, but you can find it on their website as well. Now, Mel Salisbury wants to have a word to everyone here while we're just having this chat, just about places in New Zealand with an aviation interest. So over to you, Mel.
Thank you. I'm off mute, I take it.
Yep, you're good.
Cool. Yeah, usually we travel overseas. Hopefully most of you guys know what we do. Take aviation enthusiasts off to the UK or Australia. Obviously we can't do that, our entire year's cancelled. So we're looking at what we can do here in New Zealand. So I'm putting together a list of everything I can find that would be of interest, and I'm going to put two tours together, a South Island and a North Island. Also, I think we have a lot of people that have travelled with us before that can't do the long haul or don't want to. So, as you say, this whole COVID-19 is making us all do different things. And I wouldn't have considered doing a New Zealand-based tour before, but I just now looking at it, what a great idea, because there's probably a lot more here than people think or have visited. Some of the diehards will have seen it all, I'm sure, but we'd love to take people around. So I'm just wanting to ask out any places that you know that we might not necessarily have found on Google or been referred to, just different places. I mean, the Smiths collection is obviously something that everybody knows, but nobody can get to. I'll have a chat and see if that's something we could look at. But anything else around, you can message me afterwards, just Aviation Tours NZ, find our contact details on there. But what do you know that's out there that we might not have found that New Zealanders would love to go and see as part of a tour? So we've already found a few things. Dave, you've suggested a few things. Some stuff's cropped up that we didn't know about. But yeah, just now, before I start putting it all together, I need to know what's out there and plot it all on a map and see if we can get and have a look. So just ideas, whether that's now, it might take up a bit too much time, but if people are happy just to message us afterwards with ideas, that would be great.
Is it general aviation, or as well as?
Mostly our interest is mostly with the historic stuff, I have to say, but
Yep.
Whatever is en route might be something we can drop into and have a look at as well. So really anything. I'd like to compile a sort of a comprehensive list of all of the aviation interests in New Zealand, basically. Yeah.
Cool. Has anyone got any suggestions? James, you'll need to unmute.
Hi there. Yeah, great idea. Just a couple of thoughts to follow up. Even the most familiar places, like, I don't know, the Air Force Museum, would be great if you were promoting on the basis of having a presentation by the photo archivist or one of the key staff there. I think, speaking for myself, and I think a lot of people here would probably agree, what can often make the difference is going somewhere that you might already know well, but you get to talk to or listen to someone who really knows the stuff, as we are right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's terrific. The other thing I would just quickly say is do promote it overseas. Obviously, at the moment, international travel's a no-no, but when things open up, and I'm sure we all want to support the New Zealand tourism industry. It's a very important part of New Zealand's economy, and if, you know, Aussies can get in, if the Americans can get in, when we get to that point, I'm sure we would be keen to support that. And of course, it's kind of turning your thing on its head in a way, but it's a great thing too, in that you'll be able to show the home team sort of stuff to overseas people, some of whom you'll know. So yeah,
that's right.
Pretty obvious stuff, but sounds great, and good luck.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely in mind, actually, putting something together that we can do now this year, but that we've got the bones of it there for inviting the world when we're allowed. So yeah, definitely. Good.
Yeah, well, it does sound like a good idea. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my mic falling off here. Just going to button it. No, I think it's a great idea. I've actually thought for a long time it would be good to have a sort of tour that, you know, Aussies or, you know, anyone else can come and do a national tour of our museums all in one hit. So yeah, good on you. I think it would be good. But would it be likely like a bus group type tour? Or?
I think so, yeah. I mean, if we can factor any other experiences in, we will. But already, I mean, I have pretty much planned the 2 islands already, and it's already longer than I thought it would be because I found so much to do. And you have to have time in the cities for people to explore as well. So you kind of need an extra day at leisure, thinking of the internationals. So it's already got longer than I thought, and definitely needs to be done in 2 halves. But there's a lot here, yeah, and definitely valuable advice. And we do try and make everywhere we go a little bit special, and add value and add more than, you know, Joe Public could get. But that was a good reminder there to make sure that we try and bring in something a bit more interesting in each place. So cool, thanks.
Cool. Well, feel free to put a thread up on the WONZ New Zealand forum as well. You might get some
Yeah, will
interesting
do.
ideas. And
Yeah.
yeah, excellent. The only other thing I want to say is lockdown for me has been just doing a lot of research and contacted a lot of people. And one of the things I've been doing a lot lately is trying to track down wartime logbooks of pilots, and particularly pilots, but also aircrew. And because the logbooks that I've collected copies of, I don't actually have any real logbooks. I just get either scans or digital photographs. They're just invaluable for finding information either about aircraft or about operations or about squadron history that's not in the operation record book, and particularly the likes of the operational training units, which they've not kept any records of. There's nothing in the archives to record what happened at the operational training units. And we had 4 operational training units, 2 of them for fighters, 1 for bombers and 1 for the flying boats. And all those records are gone. So it's really only what's in the logbooks that, for historians like myself, that you can piece it together. And so if anyone out there has any logbooks from RNZAF pilots or aircrew from particularly World War II, but any of them are interesting, or you know of somebody who might be able to copy them, just please get in touch. Right, is there any other interesting news or items that anyone wants to raise before we get to the next speaker? No? Okay, well, I'd like to hand it over to James Kightly now, who's our second speaker of the day. And James is going to give us a talk about a crash site of a Brewster Buffalo. James.
Thanks, folks. Well, very pleased to be here. I'm dialing in from Victoria, Australia, and very pleased to be able to support another forum. I've managed to get to 1 in New Zealand so far, and they're always great things. And great to see so many familiar faces, and those faces that are not familiar, quite a lot of the names are too. So really good to sort of connect this way. So well done, Dave, and to everybody to making it happen. It's really good to be here. Very briefly, last year I was involved with an archaeological survey. Everyone wants to call them an archaeological excavation, but we weren't excavating. And it's a long story, but I'll keep it very brief. And I have some visual aids, which I will now bring into play with my, for those that missed earlier, there's a bulldog clip at the top. Can people see that okay? Am I getting a... It's basically... The story of this excavation was a bulldog wreck, a Brewster Buffalo wreck up in the high country of Victoria. And what makes it interesting, I think, is that it's at a point in the war when things were very transient. And as Dave's just touched on with the training, it's an area that people don't really know very much about because the paperwork just isn't there. So what we have here is the period of the Pacific War. Things were very changing very fast. We didn't know what was coming then. So for instance, I'm sure most people here will be aware of the concept of ABDA, where Australian, British, Dutch and American forces were supposedly combined. Now that didn't last for very long, but at the time they thought that was important. So we're looking at buffaloes being a particular type that was supposed to be very popular, very important then. The buffalo, we all know, is a failure outside the use of the fins, but we were desperate. We took anything we could get our hands on at that point. And the buffaloes, like several other types in Australia, at this point we took them, we wanted them, and they were secondhand. You can see a great advert here that we found online for the Dutch buffaloes and how they were going to win against these Japanese, presumably the Japanese wearing the bottle glasses we all know so much about, that it didn't quite work out as planned. One of the key things was what were we going to be doing and where was it? So the wreck's not a secret, it's well known. Up on Mount Stanley, Australia is not very high, relatively speaking, but we've banged a lot of aeroplanes into mountains over the years, and tragically including this one, which was a fatal accident. And the pilot was en route from one base to another, travelling between Victoria and New South Wales. Apparently, it seems like he got lost, circled around and hit the side of a mountain and was killed, tragically. We know about him, Second Lieutenant Henry Null, Jr. We have a few bits and pieces of information about him. He had a very short flying career, as you'd expect, flying basically in the Pacific. And obviously was killed instantly in the crash. Why would you go and do an archaeological excavation? Well, we had some questions which I think are quite interesting, and that's how I got involved. Is you'd think the paperwork would be there, but it's not. We don't actually know which aircraft this exactly is. We know it's one of a batch, and in a way it's not critical, but as everybody who collects serial numbers knows, these things are important to get right. The other question, which again, sort of a modeler question really, is what colour was it? Had it been repainted? And so on. There were some other subsidiary questions, like apparently, as always with air crashes, the engine was supposed to be misfiring before it crashed. Well, yeah, they always say that, and so the question was, could we discover the engine was faulty? Well, that was obviously going to be a massively long shot. The aircraft site had been robbed out, or most of the wreckage had gone, so the chances of finding some facts weren't there, but the question was there. This is what we ended up looking at. I should say beforehand, it was a proper mountainside. It was absolutely really hard to get around on. Big rocks, gullies. It was quite a big slope, as you'll see in a moment for another photograph, and quite challenging ground. I mean, if we hadn't known exactly where it was and we were using GPS, it would probably have taken us a good 3/4 of a day to find it, even knowing a reasonably accurate location for it. And this is basically, the bottom piece here is probably the largest piece that remains. It's a classic archaeological experience, and there's not very much there. Most of the aircraft was taken many years ago by a couple of aircraft restorers, and a lot of it is now in Holland. But the bits and pieces we were able to find did tell us a bit of a story. This piece here, I was very pleased to see, because it's got a couple of Zeus fasteners and other fasteners on it. And it's about a bit bigger than a double, a monitor screen of a computer, if you like, so reasonable size. It's actually the ammunition bay cover, so incontrovertibly identifies the aircraft. That's just dirt on it. There's no actual colours or markings left, so we weren't able to get anything from that. But there were a couple of other pieces where we were able to identify some bits of paint within the folded up damaged part of the metal. So we were able to actually say that there were these colours found. Now, of course, 70-year-old colours are not, 70 plus, are not stable. So the colours we see today, even in a sheltered area that's probably a piece that was in the ground, aren't necessarily what you expect to see originally, but you can use a certain amount of deduction from how well it was applied. There were some bad paint runs, for instance. So we're pretty sure it was a repainted aircraft from the original Dutch colours. The outputs, the results of the survey, the aircraft is properly listed now, or the remnants, it's not really an aircraft as such, they're listed with Heritage Victoria and under protection from being robbed out now, in theory. There's bits and pieces of it, as I've said, in Holland and in a local museum that have ended up there many years ago. And the local museum's done a terrific job in putting the family of the pilot together with relatives and background to it. One of the saddest bits of the whole story is the pilot had a son born after he was killed by a woman in Australia. And I think they were married, but it was a formal relationship at least. But, you know, you do this stuff and then you start researching the background. I know Dave does a lot of this. And there's always the really human story that sometimes comes up and sort of smacks you in the face, like that bit of the story. And I think we never really forgot that this was a fatal crash site that we were investigating. Having said that, we had a good time doing it. The rest of the team were archaeologists. Daniel Lay, who's a good friend of ours and regular participant online, he was the kind of coordinator, and he knows his aircraft very well. But the others were straight archaeologists. They were much happier with pots and holes than they were with aircraft parts. And I was getting called all over the place to try and describe this piece or that piece as we were looking at it and to take photos. It was a very interesting exercise, and I think it was a good example, and I think we've mostly seen that now, where you're getting to see different expertise, different organisations coming to bring their knowledge and expertise to bear on a topic, and you get something more out of it. Sometimes it makes you question your basic assumptions. I would have probably said, well, you know, what's there is a few bits and pieces that were forgotten, left behind by some people trying to clear it out. We don't even know, although we think we know, that some of the wreckage was probably recovered at the time in 42. And so, you know, it's kind of like investigating an absence. You're really looking for what evidence there is left, very much like the time team programs or whatever, not something within just about living memory now. So where do we go from here? Well, the main thing was the excavation was, the survey was marked up in the Heritage Register. A number of publications were made, including one by me in Flight Path magazine here in Australia. And I will, with Dave, share a PDF version of that around, so people who are interested in the full nitty-gritty of the detail will be able to read that. Thanks to Flight Path magazine, no longer printing, unfortunately, but we can now share that particular article. And some academic outputs as well. But it also made us able to quantify how much you can investigate from a wreck that's not really there anymore. It was actually more than we expected with things like colours. We've got a whole load of serial numbers off parts. They haven't been fully tracked back now, but they will hopefully when we can match them to Brewster's records, and I'll come back to that. That will give us an idea to be able to nail down the particular aircraft. And so a top tip in the whole thing is don't go after Brewster aircraft. They're one of the worst documented US aircraft companies compared to, say, North American or, well, you know, you name them. Even Martin are probably better. And that's partly because Brewster were an absolute disaster in World War II. I think most people here are familiar with their aircraft, which were a bit of a non-starter, the Bermuda and the Buffalo and so on. But worse than that is there was some pretty major corruption, dodgy stuff about government money going astray. There's some great articles online. Got a bit of a dig around about the Brewster Aeronautical Corporation. So the records that exist, which are not very many, a lot of them are gone, are probably a bit dodgy as well. So I can recommend avoiding Brewster as a group to deal with. Final slide is just us here. This is the team on the mountainside, and I just thought it's a good illustration. Really of how steep it was. They're just sitting on the hillside. There's me in the foreground there, and we were working, you know, pretty hard to move around there. Small team, but it was really interesting how we managed to get a group of experts to come up with some different bits and pieces there. I can go on about it. Dave says I have to keep it short, so I'm keeping it short, and he's quite right. That's a good idea. But very happy to answer any quick questions, but bigger questions I think will be answered within the PDF. And as always, I'm contactable, very happy to try and have a chat down the track. So thanks very much for having me, and great to see so many familiar faces. And well, thanks very much, Dave. Questions? You're still muted, Dave.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I do have one question. You alluded to finding an individual aircraft serial number from part numbers. Is that possible? You can actually look at part numbers and actually find an individual aircraft serial number from part numbers. I would assume that part numbers would be the same from aircraft to aircraft, so it wouldn't identify a specific aircraft. But am I wrong about that? Can you find an aircraft serial number from part numbers? Thank you.
Very good question, a very good point there, Carl. Yes and no, bigger no than yes. So serial numbers on parts tend to be batch numbers or similar sorts of things. I'm not an expert on that level of detail, but we have enough that they are individual part numbers for that particular part. Now, if it was a more well-documented company like North American Aviation, say, it may well be possible by cross-checking the batch numbers and so on that you would be able to narrow it down. Obviously, in this case, we're looking at a small batch of aircraft from a very early period of the Pacific War. So they're going to be within a narrow group of the whole Buffalo production run, if you like. And I have to say, I haven't done the work, Daniel's the chap been doing that work, haven't managed to track back those numbers in detail yet because the records are just so fragmentary. It's a classic example, and I think we've all been there, where you're looking at a huge amount of work that may come up with nothing. So where do you prioritise that? It's been down the list. We know it's in a batch of, I think, about a dozen aircraft. And really the point was an experiment to see if it was possible rather than actually being certain about this airframe. I think we'd all like to have it nailed down, but how much effort are we going to put in at this stage? The other thing is that other parts that exist in other collections, like in Holland, I think they're with the Dutch military aviation collection now, because obviously the Dutch have a strong connection. That may well sort of help cross-check the thing. So again, it's an example if we really wanted to know, then putting in the work would probably come up with results. The thing I'd just say to finish that point though is it's a classic example, whereas if this was a Spitfire or a Mustang, everything would have been nailed down years ago because they're the ones everybody wants to know about. Because it's a Buffalo, it was on a train, it was on a repositioning flight, South Australia, you know, a long way from the actual war zone. It's a classic example of the stuff that I find interesting. I know a lot of other people here do, but it's never going to have the traction or interest that another more famous type might have. We also know who the pilot was, that he died, so there's no mystery there. You know, if they ever find Amelia, that will kill an entire industry. You know, the whole point is Amelia is missing. It's not that we don't know, we know she's dead. There's no question about that. But the point is, mysteries are an industry. Knowing stuff is not. So I rambled a bit there, but I hope that answered. And great to talk to you, Carl.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You did.
Yeah, thank you, James. That was great. Kevin, you've got a question?
Hi, James. Can you hear me?
I can. Lovely to hear from you, Kevin.
I haven't seen you since Tired.
Yes, quite a while.
Where was it going from and to? I see Mount Stanley's somewhere near Beechworth, and so I'm assuming from Sale to somewhere north.
I will consult my article. Where are we? The reason I'm being a bit vague, apart from not having done my homework properly, is that we weren't entirely sure initially where it was going from to, or at least I wasn't. But according to the slide, it was going from Laverton up into New South Wales to one of the main bases there. I'm pretty sure, I can't quickly find it and don't want to waste everyone's time here, but I'm pretty sure it's covered in the article. What is interesting is that he was slightly off track so flying from, you know, Victoria to New South Wales, a fair distance, not a huge flight, but a fairish distance. And he was about 20 kilometres, so, you know, 10 miles-ish off track, nothing major. Unfortunately, that's where the mountains were. So it's a classic example, minor deviation from path, probable bad weather, fair amount of cloud, probably trying to position himself to orientate himself in a 180-degree turn, and there was a big rock in the way. And it's a classic thing. He hit the mountain. We looked out from where, sort of in reverse direction of where he would have come in, and there was another mountain that he'd obviously missed, or he'd just come in through a big wide valley. And if, you know, you do those, if only he'd been a bit higher or gone slightly different. So, but the article I will share with Dave, and that's got all the SP there, Kevin.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, bad weather's probably the answer to that.
Yeah, definitely was part of it. Yeah.
We've got a question from Zach Yates.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, James. That was fascinating, but I'm not actually asking for myself. Poor Matt Austin in our chat. He's got an issue with the mic at the moment. There we are. He's hoping he hasn't missed it in the chat. But James, was the engine located?
Hello, Matt. So Matt's north of me in New South Wales, Zach's in New Zealand, and here we go. The wonders of technology. Thanks for the satellites. Great question. No, it was the engine wasn't there. There were some bits of engine. What we don't know is we're not sure whether the engine was recovered at the time of the accident and maybe investigated and the records lost. There was no record found showing that the accident investigation showed problems with the engine or not. I think, as I've said in my introduction, and I think we all know, every time an aircraft crashes in any circumstances, witnesses say the engine was running roughly or doing something, or it's an absolute given that accident investigators basically ignore that. There were a few witnesses who heard the aircraft. It was in a remote area. There's no houses anywhere near, but the town is probably 7 or 8 kilometres away, so easily you can hear aircraft flying over. So the engine wasn't recovered, and we don't think there's no evidence of the engine having been recovered by one of the Warbird restoration crews, but those guys pretty much cleared out what had been left there. So it's kind of one of the hanging questions, I think, that we didn't answer was how much disappeared in World War II, retrieved by the Australian Air Force, and how much was retrieved in the, I think it was 1980s, 70s or 80s when the stuff was gone. And unfortunately, stuff does still disappear. One thing we were able to confirm, though, is that there was either an engine fire or a post-crash fire. There was some melted aluminium pieces, little globules. We've got some photographs which show that the temperatures, obviously, in the area were high enough to melt aluminium. Steel parts were damaged, but not destroyed. So you can probably do some plotting on the temperature range that the crash, probably a post-crash fire, pretty inevitably went through. Doesn't prove the engine had a problem before he crash landed. And my take, as Kevin's just said, I absolutely agree, is that dodgy weather, high ground, those are going to be the final contributory factors. If you had an engine problem beforehand, it doesn't really change the end result, of course, and doesn't put him where he was. He would have been heading in probably other directions if he'd been trying to recover from an engine problem. But that's complete speculation, of course.
Are there any other questions out there? Cool. Well, thank you very much, James. That was really interesting. I didn't even have any clue until this that there were buffaloes in Australia. So that's
just if I can come in there. Me neither, Dave. It's a learning experience, this game, isn't it? We actually had buffaloes in WA with some boomerangs, and they nearly intercepted some Japanese attacks. It's one of those little trivia points that I just love. I know some of the guys here do as well. You kind of go, I never knew anything about it because nothing actually happened. There was an Australian, Chinese-Australian pilot, Roy Goon is his name, I remember rightly, and he actually pressed an attack on a Japanese aircraft in a boomerang, and his guns didn't fire because they weren't set right or they'd frozen or whatever. And so the one chance for a boomerang kill was missed because so it's a trivia point. It didn't happen, but for us on the inside with these sort of passions, that's great to hear. But yeah, we had a few buffaloes here, and they didn't do much. They ended up in training.
Cool. Okay. I noticed, is that Grant McKeer in there? Yeah, I thought so. Hi, Grant. My former co-host on the Wings Over New Zealand live show. This is the closest thing to doing the live show that we used to do on Warbird Radio. And unfortunately, this week we learned that Warbird Radio is no more. The whole network is now deceased. So we're a bit sad about that. The archive and everything is gone. So unfortunately, no more Warbird Radio. So rest in peace. If there's nothing else that anyone wants to ask James or bring up, we'll go on to the third speaker. Okay, and our third speaker is Charles Davis, who is going to talk to us today about his Strikemaster. Where is Charles? Is he there? Ah, there he is. There's too many people. Hi, Charles.
Hi, Dave. Hi, everyone. Is my audio working okay?
Yep, absolutely fine.
And can you see this screen that's popped up?
Yep, that's it.
Look, thanks for inviting me, Dave. And look, I've been very privileged to look after one of the ex-RNZAF Strikemasters, 7.2, and I just wanted to briefly cover how the Strikemaster came about in the first place and a little bit about its RNZAF history before talking briefly about learning to fly the thing. The Strikemaster was in service in the RNZAF for 20 years. I'll just work out how to advance these slides here. Apologies, there will always be some. It did work the other day when we did it.
It did, didn't it? It's typical.
How's that? Has that gone on to the next slide for you?
No.
You've unshared.
We'll try this again.
That's it.
Yeah, I might have to do it on a slightly different screen because it's not fast forwarding as we go through, but essentially the Strikemaster has come from the Percival Provost. That's the basic frame of the Strikemaster. And what I'm actually going to do is just click back out of sharing for a moment here and just put this.
Charles, I think it might be that you need to bring the shared screen forward. I'm not sure how, but when I gave it a bit of a play this morning, the problem I had was it got pushed to the back, and so when you clicked, it wasn't clicking on that. But I'll hand over to our technical wizard, Philip, there.
Okay.
When you go to share, how many screens are you seeing?
I'm just seeing the full screen here, but what I might do is just.
I'm not sure what's going on then.
Okay, I'll just apologies for a moment. I knew something like this. Has that popped up there? I might just leave it like that and put that on a larger screen. Does that show up like that?
Yep, that's there.
I might just have to scroll down on the side. So apologies, this is not quite how I wanted to share it with you, but look, the RAF was looking for a replacement for the Percival Prentice and put out a tender for a new aircraft. And there is a New Zealand connection here in that the Provost was designed by Henry Millicer, who went on to design the Victor Air Tourer. Now, Percival was incorporated into Hunting Aircraft and then became Hunting Percival and then into British Aircraft Corporation. And in the 60s, quite a number of British aircraft manufacturers became absorbed into BAC, and that's a whole talk in itself. But Henry Millicer here went on to, who designed the Provost, designed the Victor Air Tourer as well. So the Jet Provost came about when Percival said, look, there's going to be an upcoming need at some stage for a jet trainer, and rather than waiting for the government to ask for a jet trainer, they went ahead themselves and developed this really by putting a jet engine straight into the Jet Provost, or into the Hunting Provost. So that was the T1, and if you look at that, it's really the same aircraft with long spindly undercarriage and the same canopy system, and a lot of the components were reused, and very quickly they changed that to the T2 with a much shorter, stubbier undercarriage, now that you didn't have to worry about the prop clearance. And one of these T2s was evaluated by the RAAF, and that's now in the Point Cook Museum in Victoria. The first type of aircraft that was manufactured on a large scale was the T3, and the RAF ordered about 200 of these. And the main changes from the T1 and T2 were that it had a clear view canopy rather than that structured canopy, and ejection seats and tip tanks. And the engine at that stage had been uprated to about 750 pounds of thrust, so about half of what the Strikemaster eventually was. And then after some time, the T4 came about, and the big change between the T3 and the T4 was a much more powerful Viper, Rolls-Royce Viper 240, 2,450 pounds of thrust. And again, about another 200 of those were organised for the RAF. And from the T4 to the T5, the big change was a pressurised cockpit, so they had to change this whole system here. The sliding canopy became more angular, the wings were made stronger, and there's a much longer, pointier nose. So if you look at that nose of the T4 and then the T5, that's now looking much more like a Strikemaster with the sliding canopy. And about 100 of these were used for the RAF, and there were a number of export versions as well. And because this design was so popular, British Aircraft Corporation modified it to be used for light attack for an export version, put on 4 hard points, a much more powerful Rolls-Royce Viper 535 engine, and a strengthened airframe to be able to carry the extra ordnance that was planned. So the first customer for that in 1967 was the Royal Saudi Air Force, and that's one of their aircraft flying over Blackpool in the UK, close to where these were manufactured, and that's the assembly line at Warton, and that's the first New Zealand Strikemaster NZ6361 being built at Warton. And this is where Warton is situated in the UK, and it's quite close to Blackpool Airport. So when you look at some of the early promotional photographs, you'll see Blackpool in the background. There's a lot of testing done around the UK canopy jettison system there. I don't think they tested that often. And these were the aircraft, these were the countries that the Strikemaster was exported to. And I'm not sure why there wasn't a Mark 85 and 86, but that's how it worked. So, and I'll just run through here. The Saudis first ordered 20 of the Mark 80, and then another 25 of the Mark 80A. And a number of those aircraft, after they were retired, ended up back in the UK. Some of them flew with Team Viper, and this aircraft down the bottom here is now in Christchurch with Brian Hall. So he's got a Mark 80A Strikemaster. And those are the only 2 in the country now. That's a South Yemeni Strikemaster with its British B registration with Blackpool Airport in the background. Oman flew Strikemasters and used them quite actively. When used during combat, they took out the right seat. And these were, there's a really interesting book, Stormfront, for anybody who's interested in how they were used. RAF pilots were flying for the Sultanate of Oman, protecting them from the Darfur rebellion, and some fascinating stories of what went on during that time, with about 9 SAS soldiers defending against about 300 soldiers, or sort of terrorists coming in from the desert, and about 6 Strikemasters. That's one that's been hit by ground fire, leaking fuel, ran out of fuel, and now it's on a dead sick landing coming into Salah. A big hole out of the bottom where fuel had emptied out. That's a Kuwaiti Strikemaster. Singapore Strikemaster, and that could almost be New Zealand with the Iroquois and the A4 in the background there. Iggy Wood's book is fascinating to read, and of course he had flown in Singapore for a while and flown Strikemaster, and it's got a lot of interesting tales in that. Ecuador used the Strikemaster for counter-insurgency operations for a while. The Sudanese had ordered 10 Strikemasters, and because of an arms embargo, only 3 were delivered, and the rest went to Botswana. And that's the first New Zealand Strikemaster being test flown over Blackpool in 1972. And you'll note that the camouflage back then was a bit different. For the modelers, it's a much darker browns and greens in those photos, with the French Matra rockets rather than what was actually used in New Zealand. So New Zealand ordered 10 aircraft in 1970, and they arrived in the country in 1972. And apologies, I'm skipping through this quite quickly because of the amount of material I've previously accumulated, but that's other photographs taken on that same flight. So quite a different camouflage scheme to what we saw later on when they were repainted in New Zealand. That's the temporary B registration there. There's some fascinating videos on YouTube when they were having their official handover at the base in Wharton. So the initial 10 were ordered, and the idea was that they would be jet conversion for pilots going on to the Skyhawks. And then with the introduction of the air tourer, there was a second order for a further 6 aircraft. So everybody went through the wings course, all completed their training on a Strikemaster. Now from that first batch of 10 aircraft, 2 were displayed at Farnborough. So here's 65 on static display on the ground, and 64 being demonstrated doing a flying display, again with these French Matra rockets, which were never used in New Zealand. And from the second batch, 75 was also on a static display at Farnborough before coming across. And BAC Corporation made quite a deal at the time that of the customers who had ordered the Strikemaster, 3 went on to reorder them. Around the same time, the Australians had ordered the Mackie 326, and that was one of the other possibilities that New Zealand had looked at the time. So this is 6-1. It had been shipped to Wellington, then trucked up to Archaeological, and they came in batches of 3 initially, being taken out of its crate. I'm not sure if the engines were actually installed on the fuse at the time. They were probably separate, and I'm not sure about that. So gradually being put together, and then it was test flown October 72, and then the jet conversion course started a couple of months later. And here it was its first air show at Paraparam soon afterwards. Now, one of the advantages of having a horizontal jet pipe system was that you could operate off the grass. So here it is at Hobsonville a few months after arriving, and you could do that without burning the grass. And here's the aircraft that I now lucky enough to look after in its initial delivery scheme with this wavy demarcation line. And over time that changed, and the wavy demarcation line was taken off the tip tanks. So here's 7.2 and a couple of photographs. And then later the greens matched what the same greens that were painted on the A4s. So here it is in a much lighter scheme. And again, this was during a period of time before the air trainers were introduced, when Harvards were still being used and Devons at Wigram. So once that changed, the wings course, the pilots would do 80 hours on the air trainer at Wigram, then come up to Archaeological to do 50 hours on a Strikemaster. Here's an interesting photograph, and this comes from that recent the museum collection going online, 1976 at Archaeological with the 14 Squadron, 75 Squadron flight line, a couple of visiting 707s, Bristol freighters, Herc, DC-3s, Harvard, Iroquois. Those were the days for sure back then. So the Strikemaster was part of 14 Squadron, which was disbanded in 1992, and of course recently reformed when the Texans were introduced. And they were actively, it was an active recruiting tool, so there's a number of interesting photos of Strikemasters here early on with the old Hippo refueling system, and a later photo. And I'm not sure anybody in real life would ever see a scene like that, but that's a recruiting scene there. In the compressor wash, and of course flying low level around New Zealand with all the salt, that was something that would have to be done. So for the students converting onto Strikemasters, this was the syllabus that was done. And so before anybody would go solo, you would learn all about compressor stalls and engine fires and engine failures after takeoffs and flame outs and bird strikes and so forth, and run through this syllabus during your wings course training. There was side-by-side seating, and so on the student side you've got the trim wheel, and this is replicated on the instructor's side, the flaps, your throttle quadrant, undercarriage with the emergency override switches. And then in front of you, you've got all your engine instruments with RPM, jet pipe temperature, oil pressure, fuel selectors. All the armament switches were in the front here, flight instruments. And here's that Rolls-Royce Viper engine in the back, 8-stage axial compression. That's why it's so noisy too. There's no bypass in it. And it's got a slight kink in the tailpipe as it comes out. The fuel system, there's in the wings you can hold nearly 2,000 pounds of fuel and about another 700 pounds in the tip tanks. And if you're going flat out at low level, you'll go through all of that in about 90 minutes flat. The tip tanks are pressurised to about 6 psi and the wings to 2 psi. And there's a couple of ram intakes at the front beside the intake with a low pressure and a high pressure system on each side. And once the tip tanks are empty, these doll's eye indicators in the front cockpit will switch over from black to white. And just so that you don't over pressurize your wingtips, you can switch off the valve between those tanks. And that's something you'd switch off before aerobatics as well, so that you don't have fuel sloshing between the tips and the wings. And this indicates that you will burn more than twice as much at low level than at high level as expected. With the electrical system, there's a generator that comes online once the engine is running, and there's a couple of rotary inverters in the nose and static inverter further down in the fuse that converts DC to AC power as you need it. And I'll flick through all of that. The standard warning panel in front of you has a number of amber warnings. If your cabin pressure is too low, fuel pressure is below 3 psi, the generator goes offline, hydraulic failures, oxygen loss. And then there's a fire warning system that has an audio warning as well. So down the jet pipe, there are 4 thermocouples in the that will detect if the temperature is too high, and that will send off quite a loud tone in your ears. And that's something I've never experienced, but something that we always test before and after flight to make sure the system's working. The hydraulic system runs the undercarriage flaps, air brakes and wheel brakes, and there's a non-return valve so that if you had a hydraulic failure, you can still get the wheel brakes. You've got sufficient pressure in the accumulator to use your brakes when you land. And that hydraulic system's been modified so that you can blow the canopy off as well if you needed to. So there's a little handle between the seats here where it'll blow the canopy between 1 to 8 inches high, and the airstream will just carry the canopy off if that was required for some reason. During RNZAF service, the ejection seats were modified, and this miniature detonating cord also inserted into the canopy. So that would explode the canopy just before, as the seat was exiting. There's an oxygen system in the nose, and there's a couple of canisters here that will hold 750 litres and 2,250 litres of pressurised oxygen, and that's enough for 2 big guys heavy breathing for about 4 hours. So we don't have to top that up that often. And there's a couple, externally, this is the torque in itself, but there's a compressor blow off on the top and a couple of ram intakes for generator cooling and anti-icing. And so for the students, this was your typical circuit pattern. We keep full power now till you get to about 180 knots because that's your turn back speed. If you have an engine failure on takeoff and you throw 180 knots, you've got sufficient speed, depending on the wind and your reactions, to get back onto the runway at that time. Going backwards there. So Strikemasters became quite a familiar sight around the Manawatu, and here they are through Ruapehu in the background and around the desert road. Night flying in Auckland, formation flying. In line astern, you would line up on the ADF aerial, which was just slightly off centre, and in echelon, you'd end up with the tip tank just underneath the squadron insignia to know that you're holding position. Low flying, and of course when the Strikemasters came into service, there were low-level jet routes promulgated at that time around the countryside, and that changed, of course. There is a G meter right in front of you, hard to ignore, and a fatigue meter at the back. And you can see with 7.2, its fatigue meter reads that it's been over 7G twice. During RNZAF service, initially it was limited to 5.5 Gs, and you can see it's been over 5 Gs about 72 times. And then to limit the fatigue life on the aircraft, it was dropped down to 4.5 G. So that's the diagram we would use now. So fighter pilots would talk about corner speed, and if your VA or manoeuvring speed's about 220 knots, below that speed you can pull as hard as you like. You might G-stall the aircraft, but above that speed you're really looking in front of you to make sure that you're not going through 4.5 G. So if you're opening an air show and coming in at about 380 knots, and then you're pulling up, and as you're turning back towards the crowd, you're really looking at that speed. And if you're still going over 220 knots, you're making sure you're not pulling more than 4.5 G as you're turning back in your dare return or whatever you happen to be doing. If you're entering these vertical 360s, you're doing about 310 knots at the bottom to have sufficient energy to get up over the top. So here's some, because I can, some pictures of that. And then pilots would graduate, and there's lots of stories in and of themselves of who some of these individuals were and who they later became. So these are photos of some of the students graduating, fresh young faces. Some of these instructors would pose slightly differently. And then after you'd graduated, wing course, pilots would either go on to rotary, transport, or strike. And for those people going on to strike, you would stay on 14th Squadron, and this was the general syllabus that pilots would then go on to learn. So there were machine guns mounted under both wing roots, and the ammunition was loaded into the bay here and shot out through these areas at the bottom. And this is more a hardened steel than an aluminium alloy because of the heat of the shells coming out. So these Hispano machine guns, air combat manoeuvring, there's practice multiple bomb racks, and occasionally heavier bombs were placed. These American rockets were used just so that it was in keeping with what was used on the Skyhawk. That was over the range at Wairau there. And pilots would learn aerial strike. And occasionally heavier weaponry was used. There was an occasional mocked up photograph I've come across of air-to-air missiles, and there's much heavier bombs here. And I don't think any Strikemaster ever got airborne looking like that, but interesting photo. The Skyhawks used liquid oxygen, and so the Strikemasters carried these LOX tanks just to help transport that around the countryside for A4s that weren't being based out of Ohakea. And they were also modified to be able to be used as luggage pods as well. So those are inboard liquid oxygen tanks. And 4 aircraft were also modified to be able to tow banners. And some of them were used for asymmetric manoeuvres as well. Now, 14th Squadron would have a Falcon's Roost exercise every year, and that went right from Kightly down to Invercargill. So I've picked out a couple of photographs here over the prison at Invercargill, Dunedin from the control tower. That could only be Gisborne, Tauranga, talking to Herald reporters at Tauranga, and some of the publicity that later came out from some of these, some well-known faces here. Some lucky Herald reporter getting to go for a flight in these things. The last 2 camps were held at Hokitika and at Gisborne, and there was a combination of both Air Mackies and Strikemasters at those Falcon's Roost camps. So that last camp at Gisborne, there was an awful lot of rain, and these Strikemasters had to be towed out of the grass there with tractors. That was getting ready for the last photo op into the Merc there at Gisborne, and this was soon before the Strikemasters were farewelled. And of course, they were involved with all sorts of other exercises during time. And the most well-known was Triad 84, before the Longy government had the nuclear-free policy. And 10 Strikemasters had been based at Whenuapai to defend the base. And one of them got a kill on an F-16 during that exercise too. From the public's point of view, they commonly appeared at air shows, here showing the ejection sequence. That was a very much younger me many years ago at Ardmore. And I think just as the Strikemaster was about to be retired, this is a photograph I took from the top of a camper van on the crowd line at Wanaka. I think this was one of the most impressive Strikemaster displays I ever saw, flown by an ex-RAF exchange pilot. There were a number of incidents throughout RNZAF service, and 3 aircraft were lost. And I'll just briefly go through those. The first was when 3 aircraft were on a NAVX in the South Island, and at the end of that NAVX, the aircraft met up to fly over the parents' house of the pilot who was leading the formation, and the second pilot hit power lines, and the same power lines had been hit by a top-dressing aircraft about 20 years previously, and as the wires were joined together with the swage, that swage had wrapped around one of the pylons underneath the wing, and that if that hadn't occurred, it's possible that the Strikemaster might have just flown straight through the pylons, and that pilot ejected really just as the jet was hitting the hillside. There was one fatality. Craig Tanner, who was one of the instructors on Falcon's Roost exercise at Tauranga, was seen to have been in a dogfight and just started the ejection sequence. The canopy flew off, but sadly didn't get out. And then there was a post-maintenance test flight when there was probably too much fuel in the tip tanks during a spin, and the centrifugal force meant that the spin was unrecoverable. So it was you wouldn't normally spin the aircraft unless the tip tanks were normally almost empty, and you'd start your spin above 18,000 feet and recover by 10,000 feet. And this particular Australian exchange pilot ejected below 5,000 feet, apparently. Because of the very mountainous nature of New Zealand and lots of flying through turbulent conditions, wind fatigue became a real problem. And so over time, these inspection holes were drilled into the surfaces of the Strikemasters, and they were periodically grounded with initially rudder cracks and then later wing cracks. And various fatigue monitoring systems were introduced into the aircraft along with these wing inspection holes, and 6 aircraft went on to be re-winged, including 7-2. And so currently the fatigue index on 7-2 is about 81% for the fuselage and about 3% for the wings because of the re-winging exercise. So here's one of these jigs that was used to fit the new wings, but eventually the aircraft became grounded so often that they were replaced, and that was Project Falcon, and the Mackie 339 was selected. Right, we're just updating here. So this is one of those farewell flights to the Strikemaster over Hakia, all the aircraft that had ever flown as part of 14 Squadron, in the last photo call there. So 4 of the aircraft that were left, there were 13 aircraft left, 4 ended up at Woodburn as instructional airframes and 2 ended up at museums, 7-3 at the Wigram Museum and 7-4 originally outside the Air Force Museum at Hakia, and then it's been packed up and it's now down in the Wanaka Museum. And the remaining 7 aircraft were given to Air Mackie as part of the deal and sold on to International Air Parts in Sydney, who then sold them. And they mostly went to adventure aviation operators in Australia and a few in the States. Brett Nicholls brought 7-0 back from an operator at Port Macquarie, and he was 7-0 in one of the schemes that people might remember. And then later, 6-2, he also brought 6-2 back that had been looked after in Perth for a while and was part of a deceased estate. And those aircraft have now been sold and they're part of Blue Air Training, based out of Las Vegas, and the ejection seat's live again, and they've been rearmed and they're used for close air support training. So they're very active still, and they've got about 8 Strikemasters. That 7-2, after it was transferred across to Australia, all the military markings have been spray painted off, and it was owned by the same person who owned Brett Nicholls' number 70. And before, and that's when it's been repainted again. It was in Victoria initially before coming across to Port Macquarie, and you can see it's a much more insipid sort of a green colour after its repaint. Now, there was a breakup of a Strikemaster in flight in Australia, and that's something I looked into in great detail before agreeing to bring a Strikemaster back, because I really wanted to understand, is this something that could potentially happen? And essentially this aircraft was flying along at about 350 knots at about 300 feet high, and there's about a 200-page report that's available online that goes into great detail about what happened. But essentially the mass balance came off the rudder first, forcing the aircraft nose down, and then the right wing came off. And they calculate there was something like 200 G of force on the wing as it was forced nose down. So there was some pre-existing fatigue cracks in the wings. And essentially, the maintenance system for that particular ex-Singapore aircraft meant that it was probably an accident waiting to happen. The aircraft in New Zealand, the wings get taken off every 150 hours and undergo non-destructive tests. So as long as you stick within the fatigue limits, that's just shouldn't happen. So that's the aircraft there at Port Macquarie when I first saw it in the hangar, as it arrived at Pioneer Aero at Ardmore to be reassembled in the hangar there, and after it was repainted. A couple of people taught me to fly the thing, and there is a syllabus for civilian pilots, as I am, with no military training, converting onto an ex-military jet. And Dave Brown, who's the CFI of Warbirds, has been brilliant for taking me through that, along with Dean Beverley here. And I trained to do adventure aviation flights under Part 115, and Frank Parker did my OCA for that. But the maintenance program required by CAA has changed, so we can only do Part 91 flights now. So with Dave, I've done a low-level display approval, and this is us over one of the air shows at Ardmore, and me practicing the Cape turn again in the Hawke's Bay, doing the same sort of thing. And 7-2, just to summarise, has been part of a number of air shows since it's been back here in New Zealand, heading back down to Omaka. We had all 3 with Brett Nicholls' aircraft up at Ardmore a few years ago. And finished, that's just landing at Ardmore. So look, that's all I've got to say. That's a very fast overview of something I could talk about for hours, and happy to take any questions.
What was it that actually made you want to buy one and bring it back to New Zealand?
When I was a baby, I was brought up near Ardmore, and my parents put me out in a high chair to watch the cows in the paddock, and there's photos of me in this high chair just looking at all the aircraft flying over. And I think I had the disease that many young boys had, watching Skyhawks fly around the place, and thought, I want to do that. There's many in the audience here today that could understand that. I skipped 6th form and I hadn't appreciated that when I was in 7th form and went to the RNZAF recruiting offices. Everybody else did in 7th form. That 6th form maths, physics and English was a requirement to get into the Air Force. So the Air Force said, look, come back next year. I had a student holiday job pumping petrol at the local gas station and saved enough money to get a private license, and went to university and trained to do something else, and got a little bit out of my system, but never really lost the passion for flying like that. So, you know, I've been learning to, you know, I learned to fly over 30 years ago now, and it was just fortunate that the opportunity came up, really.
Fantastic. Are there any other questions out there? Carl.
Yes, thank you so much, Charles, for the discussion and overview. It's very similar in some ways to an American design. I hope I'm not insulting anyone by bringing this up, but the Cessna 837 T37. Do you have any experience with that, or can you make any comparison to something that I would be more familiar with? It's a neat looking airplane, and yours is very nice. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. I'm not an expert on the A37. There is one based in Tauranga at the moment. It's got 2 engines, and the performance is pretty similar, but the fuel burn is about twice as much. And you'll see that in a lot of the photos of them, they've usually got 2 underwing stores on each side just for carrying the fuel. So no, they're quite similar in terms of side-by-side seating, pressurised cockpit, ejector seats, tip tanks, noisy, lovely aircraft.
Great. Are there any other questions, anybody? Errol. Errol?
Thanks for that. Could you just tell us what the situation is with spares at the moment? Always an issue with these older jets, of course.
That was one of the real considerations that Brett Nicholls had when he sold his aircraft. You go through a lot of fuel and a lot of oil on every flight, and it's really the mains tyres that's one of the concerns. And we've arranged for a source of those that should last us for a fair amount of time yet. The Rolls-Royce Viper engine was initially rated to 1,800 hours. And Rolls-Royce put out an advisory that you couldn't fly them for more than 1,000 hours if they were in civil registered aircraft. And when my one came across from Australia, it had already done 1,200 hours. And so we had to get a new one across from the UK that was 0 timed. And so that should last us for quite some time into the future. If I can do an hour a month for the next 50 years, I'd be very privileged, and the engine should last that long. It needs to undergo lacing, wire, turbine inspections every so often. There's various hydraulic parts that we've needed to replace over time. You used to be able to get a lot of things like all the rudder bolts and aileron bolts that need to be replaced every so often from International Air Parts in Sydney, but they've sold all their parts onto Blue Air Training in the States now. So we haven't sort of been stuck too much yet. When you import these parts from Australia, it's important not to say that they're for a military aircraft. And it's cheaper sometimes to fly over there yourself, put them in your cabin luggage and come back. I think if we ever got a crack on the windscreen, that would be the real, that would really slow us down, because parts like that would be difficult to come across. And if you just block your ears, Michael Williams there for a moment, probably what we'd do is a dawn raid down at Woodburn. So there are 4 airframes down at Woodburn, you know, that potentially we might be able to negotiate with the Air Force if we got really stuck for something. I was interested to hear from Mike Nicholls that there were some Strikemaster parts found in the John Smith collection. I'd be interested to hear what they may be.
Vince, did you have a question?
Thank you.
Yeah. I'd spent some time in Woodburn training on the Strikemasters for mechanics, and I thought there'd been 6 down there, but are they still being used as instructional airframes down there?
My understanding was that very rarely they weren't really suitable anymore, and they had those Kawasaki aircraft that they were primarily using, but they may be used by some of the trades. I'm not too sure. But I had heard through the grapevine, and Michael Williams might be able to tell us more, that they were looking to dispose of them at some stage.
Oh.
But I don't know about that.
And was it 4 or 6? I thought there was 6, but must be only 4 then, is it?
There were 4 at Woodburn, and the 2 that were in museums may have at one stage been at Woodburn as well before they then went into the Harkia and the Wigram.
Oh, yeah, it was 10 years ago, so yeah, okay. Cool, thank you.
Welcome.
Charles, you've got it based at Wellington Airport, haven't you? Rongotai.
It's actually sitting at Ardmore at the moment after the most recent air show. I've left it up there. One of the issues I've had at Wellington is that every time you get a southerly coming through, you get a little bit of salt. And in one of our recent maintenance checks, we've just noted a little bit of pitting on the front of the engine. So we're spraying some ACF 50 up the front every month or so just to minimise the risk of that. You know, you've taken off some of the panels and you'll see salt crusted underneath. So Wellington's extremely harsh on airframes. So we're actually looking for a base somewhere else that's will preserve the life of the aircraft for a bit more. So yeah, watch the space.
Hamilton would be good.
Cambridge.
Yeah. We'll go grass paddock over the road. James, you got a question?
I think phrase more of a comment. A really good question from Kyle Winter earlier about the similarity to the A37 or T37, A37. I've got a friend in the States who has a T37, and of course the Tamora collection very famously has an A37, which is basically a Hoonmobile for air show work. And the key difference, I'm just wondering, Charles, from your obviously extensive research, the A37 and the T37 look very similar, but the performance is completely different because the A model has a much more powerful engine. I don't know the numbers, and they're a world away in terms of capability and aerobatics, which is obviously the main interest today. Is the Strikemaster significantly more punchy than it was as the JP?
That's debatable, and if you ask some of the RAF pilots around, they'll say, look, it's a little bit more than a T5. You know, it's got the thrust of the engine is significantly more, but it's also a heavier airframe. It's a strengthened airframe. My one's had the cannons taken out of it, so that weight is gone. And if you're not carrying all the underwing stores, then it is reasonably punchy. It's probably fairly slow acceleration compared to some things. It's probably more than an A37. With the Strikemaster, you're burning about 23 pounds per minute of fuel at low level, and at high altitude more like 16 pounds a minute. If you look at the A37, it's almost double that. You know, it's about 45 pounds a minute. I spoke to somebody recently at the Tauranga one. That's could potentially be for sale if somebody wanted to put in a bid, but you'd really want to work out the fuel bills beforehand.
Speaking of...
I don't know a lot about the T37 and A37 comparison.
Speaking of the fuel burn, have you been stocking up on fuel while it's cheaper?
Oh, look, I would have if I could have. No, I haven't. Crossed my mind.
Yeah. Warwick.
Yeah. Thanks for your talk there. Tell me, are you still able to take passengers up now, either you or Brian Hall, or aren't you covered by that now because of CAA regulations?
No, normal Part 91 flying is no problem at all. So I've done lots of cost share flights, and I have to be careful what I say because anybody can do cost share flights as Part 91. Anybody can go to a local pilot and say, can I go for a flight? And you can share half the actual costs of flying the aircraft. But what you're not allowed to do unless you're under Part 115 is advertise. And so that's why I have to be careful in a more public forum, even just talking about it. And you're not allowed to make a profit. So taking passengers is no problem at all. And I'm not sure how many passengers I've taken over time, but you know, probably 30 or 40 at a guess since I've had the aircraft.
How many hours have you done in it?
I think about 160 now.
Wow, that's good. Yeah.
Just don't. I have to be careful what I tell my wife, because when you work out the hourly cost and multiply it by that many hours, you have to shift the decimal point a little bit.
And does Brian Hoare fly his?
He does, and we've done a little bit of flying together. So yeah, right.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Warwick, I've got a question for you. When you were in the Air Force, did you actually work on the Strikemasters?
No.
Okay.
No, I didn't. I went straight from the Vampire virtually onto the Skyhawk. I think I did just a couple of months when I was in the engine servicing bay, because everyone had to have a turn of doing that sort of for 6 months, and just did a little bit of work on the Vipers as they came through, but otherwise I was virtually straight on to the J52, the Skyhawk.
Okay. Did anybody here work on them or fly them in the Air Force? Did you fly them, Michael? No? Oh, I can't hear you, Mike.
This Michael.
Yep.
Yeah, I am rated in it. I've got some experience on the Strikemaster, but not as part of the RNZAF service, no.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
In fact, it's interesting, all of the pattern speeds, handling speeds, aerobatics, everything is the same as the Texan. You can ultimately make a Strikemaster go faster, not a lot faster, but faster. But everything else is the same speed. In fact, that circuit pattern is exactly the same speed.
Wow. That's very interesting. Cool. Is there any other questions for... What was that?
Only 2 pounds per nautical mile, though, which is about 8 pounds a minute.
Right. Okay. Wow. Makes a difference.
Sure does.
So are there any other questions for Charles at all?
I think talking to some of the ex-RNZAF engineers, the Viper 535 was really reliable, and there were not really any issues with it in service. But a few people have said it sounds like Rolls-Royce really were pushing the envelope with the Mackie, with the Rolls-Royce Viper that's introduced into the Mackie, and that really had a lot of problems.
Mm.
But the 535 and the Strikemaster was really pretty robust.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. That was really fascinating. Actually, I enjoyed that a lot. And I guess we're pretty much done, unless anybody has anything else they want to say. I want to thank everybody for attending today. It's been a great experiment to have a go at this, and hands up if anybody thinks we should do it again in the future sometime. Wow, that's most of you. That's all of you.
Yes, please.
Just like to say a big thanks to Dave and Phil, particularly for bringing it together and making it possible to happen. And I've certainly enjoyed myself. And yeah, definitely, let's do it again.
Agreed.
Well, I want to say particularly thanks to Phil, because this wouldn't have happened without Phil. I had no idea about Zoom at all until I got the link from Max a few weeks ago for the Airplane Geeks thing. I'd never even seen it being used. So I just followed the link and it worked. And I thought, hey, this is cool. And what a great technology. It's just amazing. It really is. And the fact that we can connect from all around the world, and we've even got a Tasmanian on board. So no, it's really good. Cool. Well, thanks very much, everybody. And I'll probably call it quits here.
Thank you, Dave and Phil.
Cool. Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Yeah, great to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye, everyone.
Yes.
Dave. Thanks, everyone else.
See you later.
Cheers. All good.
Yeah.
And I'll put Charles's technical problems down to the curse of the WONZ presenter. I don't think you've had anyone who's managed to present without a hiccup.
That's right.
You turned us off.
Don't forget to stop your recording.
Yeah. I almost forgot to start it. It was only after I'd introduced
And I
stuff.
forgot to remind you, yes.
Yeah.
Until I saw the light come on.
See you later.